Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to welcome you to the 80th anniversary of the End of the War Symposium. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to have all of you here. What an incredible setting under the warbirds. Many of these are the planes that played such a key role in the war in the Pacific. For those that didn't notice, because you were enjoying the reception, we've got the B-25 hiding up there, made famous from the Doolittle raid, and then certainly later the Burma Bridge Busters, our SPD Dauntless that Paul Hilliard rode to fame as a scout and dive bomber. B-17, certainly overshadowed by its role in the European theater, but certainly contributed to the air war in the Pacific as well. The iconic Corsair, famous for Pappy Boyington, the Black Sheep Squadron. It's hiding up there. Of course, P-51 that would have been at Iwo Jima, part of the long-range escort for the B-29 raids we'll hear about. And then finally, our TBM Avenger, the same type flown by the youngest naval aviator, that later President George H.W. Bush. So imagine being a 19-year-old Navy officer in combat, and then how that shapes your values for the rest of your life of public service. It's also great to see the familiar faces here with us. Many of you, sorry, between the travel and conferences, it's incredible to see this. It's almost like a reunion of old friends. So great to see that. I think this is a testament to the quality of the programs that we're able to put together and provide you. Also to your absolute devotion to continuing your personal education, but to support our programs as well. And then to those watching at home, sorry we sold this out, but those that had to stay home, thank you for tuning in. I hope you're able to share the links with friends and family so they can enjoy this program as well. And then we'll capture this and have it recorded, so come Monday, people will be able to access it as well and refer back. I would like to take an opportunity as well now to recognize some of you. All of you are important guests, but let's recognize a couple key groups. Any World War II veterans, homefront workers, or Holocaust survivors with us this evening? I ask if you are, please stand and be recognized or wave. For those that are watching at home, though, let's give them a round of applause. And then any active duty service members or veterans of other eras, would you please stand or wave to be acknowledged for your service to our country as well? And importantly, those who support and serve those service members and veterans, none of their service would be possible without the family members. So family members of active duty or veterans, would you please stand and wave and be acknowledged? Thank you. Now, we put on many programs throughout the year, both for lifelong learners and through our K through 12 initiatives, which are, pretty incredible. Most of those, however, would be impossible were it not for the vast network of friends and amazing supporters from around the country. And I'd ask, would any charter members or Patriot Circle members, would you please stand or wave and be recognized? Thank you for your continued support. Now, I'd also like to recognize some of our presidential counselors that are here. They've been instrumental over the years in advising the Institute and the museum on programs, exhibition content, educational travel. Several are with us, and I'm sure many of you will have a chance to meet them later this evening and tomorrow. John McManus, where's John hiding? There he is. Craig Simons. Craig's here somewhere. There he is. There's Craig. Rich Frank, you'll see here in a moment. Nick Mueller. And of course, many of you know Nick as the founding president and CEO emeritus. Thank you, Nick, for all you've done and all you continue to do. And of course, our museum's leader, President and CEO Stephen Watson, thank you for your firm leadership, inspiration. And certainly, I'd also like to acknowledge Bob Hayes, one of our longtime trustees. He continues showing up at the conferences in an emeritus role, no doubt. Thanks, Bob. It's great to see you right here. And then we can't omit, all of our boss, particularly Stephen's boss, Suzanne Medier, is chair of the Board of Trustees here at the museum. Suzanne and Bob, thank you for your leadership, your continued support. We really, really appreciate it. It makes a difference. And now to tonight's opening keynote. The General Raymond D. Mason Jr. Distinguished Lecture Series is endowed through the generosity of Major General and Mrs. Raymond D. Mason Jr. and the Raymond D. Mason Foundation. Now, General Mason served, before he was a general, in the European Theater of Operations in World War II in the 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army. Prior to retiring from the military in 1976, he held several high-ranking Pentagon positions. His legacy of service is remembered here through this lecture series. Tonight's Mason lecture features someone you all are familiar with. Rich Frank, Vietnam combat veteran with the 101st Screaming Eagles, is one of the world's leading authorities on the Asia-Pacific theater in World War II. His seminal book, Guadalcanal, which covers the campaign that was integral in the first phases of the war. He's also the author of MacArthur, a concise and approachable but very scholarly biography of General MacArthur. Tower of Skulls, his first book in the trilogy on the Pacific War. And of course, we're all eagerly awaiting the second volume in that trilogy. And so we're trying not to bother Rich with too many tasks so he can keep on target. And of course, what he will be speaking on tonight, Downfall, the end of the Imperial Japanese Empire. Now, Rich, as you know, is a dear friend of the museum. In addition to serving as a presidential counselor, having a constant presence here on the campus, whether in person or virtually, for international conferences, media center podcasts and productions. We had a great one on Masters of the Air in 1945. Rich served as the chief historical consultant for our Road to Tokyo permanent exhibit. So we also put Rich to work abroad. He's joined many of our overseas educational travel programs around the world. We're fortunate to have him with us and on our team. Ladies and gentlemen, to take us on the road to surrender, it's my distinct honor to introduce the General Mason Distinguished Lecturer, Rich Frank.
Good evening. I guess the first thing I need to say is, did someone leave a grenade here? They're missing it now? No, I guess not. It's always a pleasure to be here in this museum, and especially in this room with all these iconic aircraft from World War II and all the other iconic memorabilia of it. Let me start, as I like to do, with a story. Last year in November, we had our international conference. It closed with a banquet, and the banquet speaker was General David Petraeus, who I assume most of you know very well who that is. And following morning, I was going to the airport to fly back, and when I got to the boarding area, I looked around and I saw General Petraeus, except he was wearing a jogging outfit. He had his head down in his phone, and he was obviously trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. But there was an empty seat next to him. So he had made some nice references to Vietnam veterans. So I came up to him and I said I listened to him last night and that I appreciated very much his comments about Vietnam veterans, and shut up and sat down. And we sat there on our own in silence for probably the better part of 40 minutes or something like that. And then as boarding time neared, I wanted to go to the men's room, as I want to do before I get on a 3-hour flight. And it's my custom to pick someone who looks trustworthy to guard my gear at the airport while I go to the airport. So I look sort of out of the corner of my eye at General Petraeus and I say, does this individual look trustworthy? And I decided the answer is yes. So I stood up and I announced that I was invoking our joint service in the 101st Airborne Division, and I was posting General Petraeus to guard my gear while I went to the men's room. So to General Petraeus' great credit, he laughed. He saw the humor in this situation, and we later had a nice conversation before he left aboard our plane. So this is one of those things where the phrase, "don't try this at home," is quite applicable. I can't recommend that you try this with every 4-star general you're ever going to meet, but I can highly recommend that General David Petraeus has a sense of humor, much like my colleagues here at the museum. This lecture really invokes 2 important principles. The first of which is that you need to speak about some important topic, and secondly, that you say something new about it and important. So that's what I've tried to organize my remarks about tonight. The whole issue of the end of World War II in the Asia-Pacific region, the surrender of Japan, is an extraordinarily complex issue. There are an awful lot of moving parts, and I only have time really tonight to pick out a few that I thought I'd like to highlight to you that I think are of signal importance with respect to this, and in areas in which I think I have something new to say. And I'm going to talk for the first part of my lecture here, a subject that's going to be a great deal about death, because that's obviously one of the signal results of the Asia-Pacific War. And I'm going to conclude by talking about life, and it's during the occupation of Japan. And I think I have some new and very interesting things to say about that. Now, a body of journalists identified the use of atomic bombs during World War II as the single greatest story in the entire 20th century. And you might think that that declaration and the fact that this was a war that involved the deaths of 60 to 70 million people, it truly changed the world, that would be enough to secure the place of the events I'm going to talk about tonight as obviously one of the great events in history, certainly in the 20th century history. But actually, that's only part of it. There's a historian, Professor Kenneth Pyle, who wrote a book called The Historians and Hiroshima, which was published last year. I know he's a very good historian, primarily because he writes well kindly about me. That always tells me that I'm dealing with a great historian over here. So what he has done in that book is he's gone into the issue that this morphed into, which is that beginning in the 1960s, there was a critical body of work by historians challenging the early narratives that tended to justify the use of atomic weapons in World War II. And here I must interject that I personally don't like to use the word revisionist. I think any historian who has new evidence or new interpretations is a revisionist, and I don't like to put a negative connotation on that word. I prefer the word critical, or the critical comments with respect to how the war ended. I think it's more accurately describes exactly what we're dealing with. So when you look at this body of evidence, it became a foundational piece of a searing indictment of basically all of American history. There were some historians who believed that it was such a singularly immoral act that it forever would bar Americans from claiming to have been of righteousness or justness in their history. And others believe that basically it has tarred everything from that point forward in American history. This burst out of the cloisters of the Academy, and became a national issue at the time of the Enola Gay controversy in 1995, and it's very much with us still. So that's sort of the point of departure, the first part of my talk. Quite fundamentally, I believe that this moral indictment and much of the other criticism works from literally a grossly upside-down portrait of the number and identity of the war's victims. Further, the factual premises that the factual premises of this narrative, I think, were fundamentally undermined by the body of evidence that was released from the 1990s forward, and showing that much of the presumptions and assumptions that were made by those historians were in error, sometimes grossly in error. And I want to move us on from that to some other issues, but the moral issue and how I approach that, I think, is the single most important thing I want to talk about this evening. I regret to report that for about 8 decades, the standard narrative framework that's been used in the U.S. and most of the West about this event, I believe, is in error, seriously in error. The conflict was not simply the Pacific War. The Pacific War is an event that's defined as extending from December 1941 to August 1945. It overwhelmingly foregrounds the conflict between the U.S. and Japan across the Pacific, and it only identifies a handful of other significant participants: the Filipinos, the Australians, the Pacific Islanders, New Zealanders. It's a very limited, narrow window in which to look at these events. I think the conflict, properly understood, should be called the Asia-Pacific War. It commenced with Japan's war in China beginning in July 1937 and only ended officially about 97 months later. Japan enormously expanded the war in December 1941 and eventually would reach India on the west, and it would pierce far into the Pacific on the east. The numbers that were involved in the Asia-Pacific War, as much of the numbers we deal with during World War II, are uncertain. To a very large extent, no one was keeping accurate score. Keeping accurate score was very difficult with respect to participants and deaths. But I've spent a lot of time with those numbers, and what I want to share with you tonight is not all the work I've done that, but some basic conclusions I've reached about what are fair, reasonable numbers with respect to the Asia-Pacific War. And I should add that in this, what I've attempted to do is basically look towards low-end numbers for everyone except the Japanese, and use a high-end number for the Japanese, because even if you do that, the disparity is so great between Japanese civilian deaths and other civilian deaths, it's still absolutely stunning. I believe the Asia-Pacific War resulted in the deaths of about 25 million human beings by a conservative count. Of these, about 6 million were military personnel of some form. About 3 million of them were Chinese, about 2 million of them were Japanese, and the balance were all others. The museum has a website here that puts the total number of American deaths, both military personnel, merchant mariners, and some civilians, at about just under 115,000. Their math alone tells you then that if there are 25 million total deaths and 6 million of those are military, that means that no fewer than 19 million are civilians. And when you look at those numbers, you're going to notice immediately that the disparity between the number of combatant deaths and the number of civilian deaths in the Asia-Pacific War is about 3 to 1. And as best I can determine, that is higher than the rate in the European theater, which does not get above about 2 to 1, primarily due to the enormous loss of military personnel on the Eastern Front. Now, when you break the 19 million figure down, what you find, in my view, is that, sorry about that. You're talking about 1 to 1.2 million Japanese civilian deaths. You're looking at about 12 million Chinese civilian deaths, although the numbers that have been published in academic and other forums or whatever here go way, way up above that number, but I stick with about 12 million. In addition to that, you've got a total of about 2.7 million people of what's now Indonesia. About 2.4 million of them starved to death, and about 300,000 were victims of being slave laborers and dying in Japanese service. In addition to that, you've got about 1 million people of what's now Vietnam, particularly in northern Vietnam, who died in 1945. And you've got about 2.3 million others, all the other places that Japan occupied and inflicted various forms of either direct action to kill people or their economic policies, which resulted in mass deaths from starvation and disease in so many areas. You have question when you deal with this as to who was a civilian in Japan in 1945. Japanese leaders in March of 1945 issued orders that all Japanese males aged 15 to 60 and all Japanese females aged 17 to 40 became part of what they called volunteer patriotic units. They received minimal military training. They received no distinctive uniforms to set them apart from civilians. And they confirmed the American fear that an invasion of Japan was going to be facing a fanatically hostile population. A major fraction of every single Japanese city, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus contained a substantial number of individuals who were, in effect, Japanese combatants, although ostensibly they would be civilians. They had been formally inducted into service of the Empire of Japan. And this issue, which, when you're familiar with it, you feel, just how ghastly that was when you imagine what that would have been like in terms of an invasion of Japan. This is an issue that has been almost entirely neglected in the critical literature. They don't want to grapple with the fact that who was a civilian in Japan is a much more complicated issue than simply assuming everyone in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and other places was, in fact, a civilian. Now, just how stunning this distribution with respect to the disparity, I think, can best be illustrated with a slide. And when you look at that, that's the 1 to 18 ratio. And you look further at the, over there, as you look at it to your left, Japanese, if you counted all the dead in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both immediate and latent, which was about 210,000, about a fifth of that the image on your far left, they would be people who died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, either immediately or latently. You look at what you're looking at there in terms of the death of all other peoples, almost entirely other Asians, almost entirely other non-whites. In my work on this, I deal a lot with historians from the PRC or work on history from the PRC, from Indonesia, from other places in Asia, Southeast Asia, the Philippines. And I can tell you that in an interaction with them, you repeatedly are being told that they just cannot understand how the Western and American historiography has basically talked about the deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and not a peep about the deaths of all these other Asian civilians. And I think if we properly recognize this, it's important. But let me add one other point about this. I am disturbed by the fact that so much of this critical historiography does not enumerate and does not describe the deaths of non-combatant civilians who are not Japanese. But when I was writing my book, Downfall, I was very conscious of this, and one of the things I wanted to make sure I did was I was not going to treat the Japanese like some of this other literature treated these other Asians. And if you have ever read my book, you'll find that it starts off with a very searing description of the Great Tokyo Fire Raid in March 1945, a very graphic description by name and by horror after horror of what's happening to the Japanese, mostly civilians. I also have a very extended passage with respect to what it was like to be on the ground in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, because I did not want to do what I thought was being done by other historians, which is to not to count and not treat as sharing a common humanity some part of the death toll in the Asia-Pacific War. And I wanted to treat the Japanese who died like I treated all the other people I address. And what I'm doing in the trilogy right now with respect to the Asia-Pacific War is very much grounded on exactly this point. It's the Asia-Pacific War. It's not only a military conflict, but it's this great moral issue that hangs over us with respect to what happened during World War II. Now, very briefly, I want to touch on what I call the invasion that never was. Part of the controversy that's enveloped the use of atomic weapons for years has been the question about whether there was a trade-off between atomic weapons and the U.S. plans to invade Japan. The critical literature had a lot of work challenging that. That was up through the mid-1990s. Well, what it turned out was that there was a huge body of American evidence and some Japanese evidence that had been classified and not released because it talked about radio intelligence. And the radio intelligence classification that was followed after World War II not only expressly classified the raw products and raw materials with respect to radio intelligence, but it also led to the classification of papers, documents that talked about radio intelligence. They wanted to leave no trace of that type of evidence. And to a large degree, I would say that Mr. Truman and his administration effectively forfeited their very best evidence, because I believe if that evidence had been out there from the 1950s, we would never have had the controversy develop in the direction it did, mainly because what that intelligence showed was the Japanese had a plan in January 1945 they called Ketsugo, Operation Decisive. It was premised on the notion that despite Japan's otherwise truly dire situation, American morale was brittle. It could be broken if they could either defeat or simply inflict tremendous casualties on the initial American invasion of Japan. They would secure a negotiated peace that would preserve the old order in Japan. And of course, the story that we didn't know that we know now is that the Americans went along until July, when they suddenly began realizing from radio intelligence this stupendous Japanese buildup on Kyushu. And you get into the days before the actual use of atomic weapons, the picture that was being depicted was truly horrifying, and it had lots of results in terms of people looking at alternatives, General Marshall looking at the prospect of, for instance, using the supply of atomic bombs to support the invasion of Japan. But above all, the Navy, led by Admiral Ernest J. King, was resolved there should never be an invasion of Japan because the casualties would simply be too much for the American public to. So he was looking to blockade and bombard, which is a strategy that really looks to threaten to or actually kill literally millions of Japanese by starvation. So you're looking at this is what you're looking at in short visual form. What you're looking at on the left is what we thought with the bargain we were getting when we made our plans to invade Japan. What you're looking at on the right is what the picture was by end of July, early August 1944. We're looking at 3 times the Japanese defenders. In fact, the defenders would outnumber the invasion force because more than half the invasion force was going to be support troops to put up airfields and other logistical things to support a further operation towards Tokyo. So that's really what was going on. And when people talk about, no one feared the invasion, no one feared the invasion casualties, we now know that was completely untrue. And in fact, it's really a big question because Admiral King was bringing on a showdown right as the war ended about whether there should be any invasion of Japan whatsoever. So that whole issue, I think, we should understand that's been taken care of by the release of new evidence. Now, the next thing I want to talk about really gets to, I think, the heart of the issue about the controversy about ending the war. I think the first thing you have to understand with respect to ending the war is it's 2 steps, not one. Someone in Japan, in the leadership, had to decide that Japan would actually capitulate to end the war. That's the first step, but that's not going to end the fighting. The second step is you have to have Japan's armed forces complying with that decision. And that was very much up in the air, both as seen from Washington and as seen by many people in Japan, particularly Emperor Hirohito. The immediate caution I have to issue from these 2 principles that the inadequacy of the framework that was propounded, it started in the Cold War, and it basically said, well, the whole thing comes down to only 2 possible causes. It's either going to be the atomic bombs or it's going to be Soviet intervention. And what I want to address here with you is where we are now, based upon a great deal more evidence that's come out over the last decades with respect to exactly what was going on. And here in a very condensed form is what I think, or my understanding of where we are with respect to these very contentious issues. Almost contentious as my page is here, I must say. Sorry about that. In Japan, there was a group we tend to call the Peace Party, and this was some of the top Japanese leadership, both on the armed forces side as well as some of the civilians. And they had developed a plan between March and June 1945 in which they realized that the only way they could bring the war to a close, as they talked about, was to have the emperor intervene to effectively break the deadlock Japan was in with respect to its military-dominated government. When the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, opened its bomb bay doors on the morning of August 6th, the problem was that the tight grip of the Japanese militarists in their strategy, which they called Ketsugo Operation Decisive, was unchallenged at that point. And it had a political end to it, which was they believed that by staging that battle in the Japanese homeland, they would break American will and they should then get a negotiated peace, much to the taste of them, which preserved the old order in Japan, which of course was an absolute anathema to the United States. They received word after the blast at Hiroshima that something really dreadful had happened, and then they had monitored a broadcast by President Harry S. Truman, who announced that later that day that the attack on Hiroshima had been done by an atomic bomb. Now, there was an inter-cabinet in Japan, which officially called the Supreme Council for Direction of the War, but it was always known in shorthand in Japan and since in the history as the Big Six. And here you see the lineup as we're going to find here after Hiroshima. The Big Six had three members that we tend to look upon as the peace group, and then we have the hardliners on the other side. The critical issue with respect to what was going on was that although the inter-cabinet, this Big Six, had the absolute power of decision-making with respect to Japan's fate, it operated under a protocol in which the Big Six could only enact or implement a policy by unanimous vote. It had to be 6-0 or there was no policy. And you'll see here, if you look at the lineup there, there's only one civilian in this Big Six, the Foreign Minister of Togo. So the military had not only a position of stranglehold on the Big Six, but under the rules they had like 5 vetoes for anything that was not to their taste. Now years ago I was at a conference and I was giving a talk on this similar area, and after it was over, a historian from Japan came up to me and we were chatting. He had interesting things to say. And I remarked to him, I said, you know, it's extremely difficult to explain to an American audience now just how dysfunctional the Japanese decision-making process is, or was at that time. And he looked at me and said, you should try to explain it to a Japanese audience. You know, this is, I've said many times that, you know, basically Imperial Japan had the most dysfunctional strategic and military policy-making body of all the combatants in World War II. And when you think that the Italians were ahead of them, you can see just exactly how horrifying the picture I'm presenting of this. Okay. Well, after word of Hiroshima reached the Big Six, the Imperial Army insisted that they had to have an investigation to confirm that the Americans had actually used an atomic bomb. What's really fascinating is that the Imperial Navy, in the form of the Navy Minister Toyota, said, well, you know, maybe the Americans do have one atomic bomb, but they can't have that many of them. They won't be that powerful, and maybe international pressure will dissuade the Americans from using them. Now, what gets skipped over in this process, which I find a very important point, is that the Big Six did not, after Truman's broadcast, convene some technical experts, some scientists, to explain, hey, what is this thing, an atomic bomb? They knew. They all knew, right, from that moment when they were told that the Americans had used an atomic bomb. And they had this meeting and they had this discussion. So the problem was not, from their perspective, whether the Americans had an atomic bomb or not. The problem was these other issues with respect to, well, essentially, well, do they really have an arsenal of these weapons, whatever here. So I think if you understand that, you'll understand why this mooted issue of a demonstration of a bomb would never have worked against the Japanese leadership. Their response would have been, that's very interesting, let's see you do 3 in a row, right? And we didn't have that many bombs to be doing demonstrations. And the scientists had American scientists had some other issues with respect to this, not to mention the least was you announce you're going to do demonstrations, they put some POWs in the neighborhood or things like that. So yeah, the idea that the demonstration of an atomic bomb working to induce Japan's surrender is probably the least credible issue that's come out of this critical literature in all these years. Now, what we, I was going to mention, that actually this whole idea that it would take more than one bomb was actually originally mooted by an American admiral named William Purnell, who said right from the get-go, he said, well, we need one bomb to show we have a bomb and a second bomb to show or bluff that we have an arsenal. And General Leslie Groves, who headed up the Manhattan Project, picked up on that. And he would say repeatedly through this period, it's going to take at least 2 bombs, maybe more. Sometimes he said more, but at least 2 bombs to get the Japanese to surrender. One to show we've got a bomb, and a second to imply we've got an arsenal of these weapons. Now, while Hiroshima, in my view, was important, it actually hit 2 other targets. By far the most important of these was Emperor Hirohito. We had a statement immediately after the war by Foreign Minister Togo, I mentioned, who said he met with Emperor Hirohito in the afternoon of August 8th, 1945. That's 2 days after Hiroshima, but before Soviet intervention and before the Nagasaki bomb. And at that meeting, Hirohito said the war must end right now. I mean, this is the first real evidence that the emperor is going to intervene and break the deadlock and bring the war to a close. And I'll come back to the emperor here in a while. At the time, I saw some reference to that back in the 1990s. There was no supporting evidence for that, and I was skeptical. One of my mentors, Bart Bernstein, looked at me one time when we were having a discussion. He says, "Rich, you're a very suspicious person." Well, it makes you a good historian. You want verification. You want to look at all the evidence, and you want to make sure you assign, credibility, probative value, as we used to say in the law profession, to evidence before you just accept anything that somebody said, especially after the event. So we got confirmation from a member of the imperial household who wrote a memo which almost word for word quoted what Togo said. And Dr. Noriko Kawamura, who you're going to be hearing from tomorrow, she's written a tremendous book I highly recommend, Hirohito and the Pacific War, that talks about this. I think it's the best account in English with respect to, if you want to know who Hirohito really was, you read her book. And she also agrees that, this is what the emperor did on the 8th of August. So this is before, again, Soviet intervention or the Nagasaki bomb. Now, the other thing that the Hiroshima bomb did that normally doesn't get noticed is that it basically startled Joseph Stalin, and he decided to up the date in which the Soviets intervened in the war. They originally planning were not going to intervene until the 11th of August, and at his order, the Soviets began intervening in Manchuria on the Asian continent during the night of August 8th, 9th, 1945. So in a way, the Hiroshima bomb, basically, it was, in my view, I've sometimes said, the history gods, are mocking us, because what they've done is they prevented a controlled experiment from being conducted as to, which of these causes was most responsible for the Japanese. It basically ended up with the fact that we had Hiroshima, Soviet intervention, and then Nagasaki. 3 dramatic events in 3 days. And if you read the accounts of the Japanese leadership during this period, you're going to find that, they all talk about the shock, the multiple shocks. And when you read their accounts, you'll see right there on the printed page, between accounts, they'll go from, well, I think the main causes of the surrender were A, B, and C, and then they give another statement. They say, no, it's C, B, A. They themselves could not say. And there is a credible amount of historical analysis saying that basically it's almost impossible now to untangle what motivated the leadership. But I would argue that there's one major exception to that, and that's Emperor Hirohito. As an attorney who's worked with witnesses and documentary evidence for about 30 years, one of the most basic principles that you learn, if not in law school, it's taught there, but you learn it certainly in practice, is that all other things being equal, the first thing you look at is what a witness recorded or said at the time. Documents most proximate to the time carry the most weight. That's where you look to find out what really happened. Human memory is very fallible. It's highly subjective. to later acquired information. It frequently has an internal editor, which tends to put someone in the best possible light. That's a very common feature of it. It's not to be relied upon as you get further and further away from events. Now, I think, however, when you look at the multiple shocks, there's one other thing that you can extract from that. If you understand or have some understanding of Emperor Hirohito and who he was he that formidable a thinker, or was he that steely a personality that he was impervious to these huge shocks? And that he could have, in those days between the 6th and the 15th of August, have invented an entirely false story about his decision-making. And my answer to that is, it's not very likely. I think he was a human being at one level, and the same rules applied to him. And I think if you go back and you look through the record, what you find from his first broadcast, from his first announcement to Togo on August 8th, when he had finally decided that the war had to end, he displayed from that point forward a determination to see it through to the end. And that's why I think it's extraordinarily important in trying to analyze these events to understand that if Hirohito does not do these things, I just don't think we come out to an organized surrender of Japan in 1945. Now, when he talked about the reasons behind his decision, he mentioned Soviet intervention just once in the days between the 6th and the 14th of August, and even that was in conjunction with the atomic bombs. Otherwise, he didn't mention it at all in everything we have recorded that he said. He does mention expressly his loss of faith in Ketsugo, that strategy to stage this final cataclysmic battle against the first invasion of Japan. And of course, that struck directly at the core rationale for continuing the war by the people we call the militarists who controlled the Big Six and effectively the Japanese government. He also would refer in those days several times to American bombing, both conventional and atomic. But most intriguingly, he kept coming back to one subject, which he referred to as the domestic situation. And one of the things that is really striking to me about the critical literature is that somehow that sort of disappears from history in terms of the events that occurred, even though the emperor expressly mentioned it several times and expressly put it in his broadcast to the Japanese people explaining his decision. Now, perhaps I think the most memorable statement that was made by a Japanese leader concerning the domestic situation was made by Admiral Yone, the Navy minister, on the 12th of August and recorded at that time by one of his aides. And he said, and I quote, "I think the term is inappropriate, but the atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, gifts from the gods. This way, we don't have to say that we have quit the war because of domestic circumstances." So what were domestic circumstances? This was a euphemism used by Japan's senior leaders, referring to the fear that an internal revolt would erupt, which would destroy, not only knock Hirohito off the throne, but destroy the entire imperial institution. And when you look at the driving causes of the domestic situation, I say clearly, as by the time Hirohito was referring to them, it was a combination of the terror and mass deaths of the American bombing. It was also a result of the privation and incipient starvation caused by the American blockade. And I think that factor, which Dr. Kawamura's highlighted heavily in her work, I think clearly was one of the leading causes for motivating Emperor Hirohito, and thus was absolutely essential in terms of producing an end to the war. Now, other times Hirohito spoke of, excuse me, I lost my place there. When you try to then untangle all of this and come up with a rank ordering, I think the loss of faith of Ketsugo played an important part because it showed that he definitely no longer regarded the Big Six as having a solution to Japan's dilemma. And I think that when you look at the other factors that were involved here, you have to recognize we're talking about a combination now of the atomic bombs, domestic circumstances, which means you're looking also at the blockade and the American bombing. So these multiple causes resulted in Japan's surrender. Of these, I still would tend to highlight the atomic bomb because it did the first step, which was move the emperor off of being silent to moving to break the deadline to end the war. Now, I've talked a good deal here about these issues, and these issues, of course, have heavily involved death. And I wanted to end this discussion with talk about life. Just prior to when the occupation began, in August 1945, Washington sent instructions to the occupation commander, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. He was expressly told he was to do nothing about the emperor without clearance from Washington. And he was also told in these instructions that the Japanese government would be responsible for Japan's internal affairs, and this very much included feeding the Japanese population. Now, American pledges to the Japanese in terms of the surrender included the fact that ordinary Japanese would not be subject to war crimes trials, and those overseas would be returned to Japan. At that time, there were about 6 to 6.5 million Japanese overseas, split almost evenly between military personnel and civilians. At the same time, there were hundreds of thousands of other Asians who had been held in Japan mostly as slave laborers, and they were to be repatriated to their home country. These two events, this mass migration, set up sort of the perfect storm of conditions for the possibility of mass epidemics involving a medical textbook of diseases, including cholera, typhus, and smallpox. One particular episode was illustrative of this. A group of 17,000 Korean slave laborers were being returned to Japan. They got to Busan. There was an outbreak of cholera, and in short order, 11,000 of the 17,000 were dead. That's the sort of draconian results you get from mass epidemics. Now, the fellow who was the head of the occupation, I'm sorry, this is frozen. Can you move us along to another slide? Okay. This is not the first catastrophic failure of PowerPoints in my life. So I'll have to wing it, and you'll have to, well, I won't do that. Okay. There was a fellow named Crawford Sams. He was a colonel, later became a brigadier general. He was a trained neurosurgeon, and neurosurgeons are a very special breed of doctors. If you don't believe that, just ask them, and they'll tell you that they're head and shoulders above everyone else, like most surgeons. That's a very special profession. He had been in the Army Medical Corps. He'd been a senior officer by World War II and been involved in medical planning and sending some planning. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Over here. There's Crawford looking at his usual smiling self at you. He's very authoritarian, very driven, very no-nonsense, not a guy for your dinner party, but, he's not really, if you were a germ or virus, you weren't really fond of him. He recognized this tremendous crisis that they were facing with respect to this, and he took immediate and dramatic action. He got the Japanese medical profession, which had been entirely under the thumb of the Japanese militarists. He freed them up. He ran a headquarters that never had more than 150 Americans and some Japanese in it, and he mounted a whole succession of these dramatic efforts against these various outbreaks of various epidemics throughout Japan in 1945, 1946, into 1947. In addition to that, he instituted a lot of other medical reforms. One dramatic measure of his success was the Japanese annualized death rate in 1940, which is to say before they got into war with the U.S., was 18.7 persons per 1,000 persons per year. By 1952, at the end of the occupation, the annualized Japanese death rate had collapsed to 8.1 persons per 1,000 persons per year. In other words, he'd more than halved the Japanese annualized death rate in that time. And during that time, heading off all these epidemics, the leading first-generation Japanese historian of the occupation, a fellow named Eiji Takame, who was a very good historian and a pretty tough grader, he wrote that he thought that Sam's effort had saved perhaps, he said, as many as 3 million Japanese lives. Well, as I mentioned earlier, if you were listening carefully, the total number of Japanese who died between July 1937 and the end of war was probably about 3.2 million. So Takame is saying that Crawford Sams by himself in his efforts saved as many Japanese as were lost in the whole Asia-Pacific War. And amazingly enough, this is the lesser life-saving effort involved in the American occupation of Japan. And now I have to move along to, I ask you to indulge me and not engage in demonstrations here in the aisles, but I have to mention Douglas MacArthur. And I realize there are strong feelings frequently about General MacArthur. I share those. I mean, I've spent a lot of quality time with Douglas MacArthur over the years, and I oscillate, one moment you're thinking about decorations, not very long thereafterward you're thinking about firing squads. I mean, you go back and forth with respect to his performance. There is so much to criticize, and there are other things that you have to admire, and this is one of them. What happened when the American occupation began? Immediately, Japanese officials began telling the American occupation authorities that Japan was heading towards a food crisis, that the 1945 rice crop had collapsed, and that there were likely going to be famine conditions in the middle of 1946. At that time, the Japanese operated in what they called a rice year. The major rice harvest was in September, October. The new rice year began on the 1st of November. And it was like, mathematical. I mean, you took what the rice crop was, you divided it up over those days of the rice year and looked at the population and see what you got. And the answer was that they were not going to have enough food, even at very reduced rations, which the Japanese were on in 1945. The collapse was between about 10 million metric tons to about 6.4 metric tons. Now, what's particularly significant with respect to this is that the rural people, the farmers, the producers, they were going to have enough food to eat regardless. However, the population that was at risk was the urban dwellers. And in the end of 1944, as best we can tell, there were about 44 million of those. Now, due to the bombing and then the severe food crisis that ensued right after the end of the war, there was a tremendous depopulation of Japanese cities. So the urban populations collapsed by about a half. And MacArthur was convinced by December 1945, that the Japanese were correct and they were going to face a famine in 1946. He further concluded that the only thing that could save them from a catastrophic famine was U.S. food. And he knew that was not going to be an easy sell with respect to the Japanese. Oops. Okay, I don't care. You can put it up now. He had, in January 1945, he began a campaign, a crusade, to convince Washington that we had to send U.S. food, lots of it, to Japan. This did not go over well in Washington. It was very Eurocentrically oriented. There were lots of other places like India and Germany that were desperate for food. It took a long campaign, and MacArthur did what MacArthur does best, which is after sort of the rational, reasoned pleas for how that should be done, he decided to scare the hell out of them and sent them very apocalyptic depictions about how the famine would take place, there would be civil disorder that would be uncontrollable, basically the occupation would collapse, certainly physically and also morally. And if we let millions of Japanese starve to death, what do you think our message is? We've come to bring you freedom and all the delights of Western democracy. I don't think that would have sold very well. President Truman, to his great credit, in May of 1946, agreed that the food had to be shipped. It was shipped. You can see here in this slide, you'll notice that I should tell you that the entire population of Tokyo at that time was about 2.5 million. So this tells you that we were feeding every single Japanese in Tokyo in July and August 1945. I don't know about you, but I can't go 2 months without any food, and I don't think many people could. We're feeding the numbers you see elsewhere there with respect to the numbers you see in July, August, and September 1945. This is probably equal to, or just about equal to, all the Japanese in those urban areas who had remained through up to this period. So we're feeding basically Tokyo and everybody who's in other major cities in Japan in 1945. The records on this which I found at the MacArthur Memorial Archive with the great help of Jim Zobel, which you'll hear from tomorrow also. They wrote up that they think that the food program saved them, they put it 11 million Japanese from starvation. Notice they didn't say from death, they said from starvation. I think realistic number would be that if this had actually gone on to absolute collapse, you're looking at between 3 and 6 million Japanese starving to death in 1946, on top of the 3 million that Crawford Sam saves. And I would submit to you that I'm not aware of any other instance, at least in the last 1,000 years, in which a conquering power has occupied an enemy nation, and in that occupation saved more lives than they took in the war. Thank you. And now we're going to do some Q&A.
Well, thank you, Rich. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can raise your hand, Connie or I will bring the microphone to you. Rich, we're going to start in the front row to your right.
Okay, very good.
As usual, this was wonderful. But I just wanted to say there was another issue that I had read about in doing research for a book I wrote, that in addition to the threats that MacArthur was raising, they're all going to starve, they were only going to give him 200,000 troops to occupy the country.
Right.
And he said, I can't occupy this country if I'm not getting more help. And I think that was like the double threat he was making. So.
Yeah, right, that was part of it. When the occupation first began, we had Allied support, and we had a lot of troops there who immediately came to Japan after the Japanese surrender. But the backstory to that is what Washington had idle dreams, at least the Army and Navy had, the notion that we're going to maintain fairly substantial forces to occupy Japan. The American public wanted everybody home as soon as possible, and the numbers just collapsed, and it got even less than 200,000. I mean, there weren't enough bayonets to enforce our will had there actually been a catastrophic breakdown of the whole situation in Japan. And Washington knew it. I mean, one of the pitches I didn't mention in my talk, which on long enough, to say the least. But one of the things that was brought up, MacArthur said, either send me troops or send me food, and he knew that there was no way they could send the troops. Thank you. It's a very good point.
Rich, next question is going to be to your left in the front, please.
Hi. My father is a World War II vet. He enlisted in the Marines when he was 19, the month before Pearl Harbor, and served in Guadalcanal. So I would like to read your book. But about what you're talking about today.
I can recommend it.
I'm sure. My husband and I were in Japan on 9/11. Because my husband's a professor, and he was doing a sabbatical there, and our kids were in 2nd and 5th grade at the time. And 9/11 happened, and we spoke to the Japanese people around us, and some of them were very filled with regret for us, the United States. They sympathized with us, they empathized, and they said that we helped them a lot after World War II. I mean, I'm not a historian, but is the Marshall Plan related to this?
No, that was in Europe, but
Okay.
there were, one of the things about the American historians produced after World War II was, they like to have primary sources to work from, and the occupation turned out gigantic collections, warehouses full of records that were the subject of American PhDs for generations. Thereafter, it was subject. Yeah, the goodwill with respect to that, it certainly endured. I think, in fact, my impression from talking to a lot of Japanese and reading a lot of accounts is that even though some things we did in the occupation were not popular, that feeding the Japanese established that we meant well. We did not mean to have a vengeful occupation and exact retribution against the average Japanese. That was one of the most important things that was a result of feeding the Japanese in 1946.
Rich, the next question is going to be all the way to your left towards the back, please.
Okay.
Thank you. I hate to ask a historian to recommend other people's books. I feel I can do that because I own all of your books and have read them.
You have exquisite taste. What can I say?
Exactly. Can you recommend a book about or more than one book about the occupation of Japan? I've read many books about the occupation of Germany, but I don't find them about the occupation of Japan.
Fortunately, I can answer that question. The great book, in my view, about the occupation was by D. Clayton James, who wrote a trilogy on Douglas MacArthur. The third volume very much concerns the occupation of Japan, of course, in the Korean War, and then MacArthur's life after Mr. Truman assured him that he would have a life after Korea. But he covers an enormous topic. There were so many dimensions of that occupation. You could have multiple conferences just about that subject. But it's a fascinating subject. And MacArthur, there was, at the time, he clearly we would call him of a conservative bent, but I think to really understand him, I would describe him more of a Victorian. If you understand the subtleties of that designation, these were people who had a very strong sense of noblesse oblige, that they were privileged and they needed to justify their privilege by performing, in effect, good deeds, as we would call them, for other people. And MacArthur, I think, very much looked at the world that way. And the occupation was just filled with all kinds of very dramatic reforms. Crawford Sams, he put basically socialized medical care in Japan. You read that, it's just an amazing story. But that's a place to start. There have been quite a number of really good books that have been published on it, but that would be the place I would start.
Rich, we're going to stay to the left, about halfway back in the center of the aisle.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I was curious to learn more. What was the basis for Japan's leaders' concern about domestic unrest? Had there been increases in arrests of resistance leaders or protests or anything like that?
Okay. Well, if you study Japan's history, you'll see that during the Great Meiji Restoration, there was a great deal of civil turmoil during that period. So it was within living memory that they had serious issues with respect to civil turmoil. And the regime was carefully, there's a literature on that. John Dower has covered that a lot with respect to the fact that people, they had agents going around reading graffiti that was written in train stations and things like that were reported as serious evidence of civil unrest or whatever. So it was various, and I think also what you have to get back to, if you look at the value system that had been instilled into the Japanese, all the Japanese and the leadership, the notion of preservation of the kakute, the Japanese way. It's very hard to translate that directly into the American experience, but sort of an essence of what it meant to be Japanese. And the notion for most Japanese that whole system, which they identified as being the very identity of being Japanese, was going to be overthrown by Japanese people, was, I think, the most awful thing that most of them could contemplate, even more so than the possibility of the Americans or the Russians coming in and changing the government, changing the emperor institution or whatever here. That was, just almost unimaginably terrible for anyone to contemplate.
We're going to stay to your left with Connie, Rich.
Okay. So we're leaning a lot to the left, you'll notice here. I don't know whether there's any significance in that or not. Yes.
I think you allude to this in Downfall and maybe a little bit early on tonight. Had the bombs not been dropped and the emperor stepped in and said we have to sort of stop, the strategic bombing campaign that would have continued in 1945, already the transportation network was almost destroyed, but that would have destroyed it completely. And with an embargo of anything coming in to Japan, is it reasonable to assume that the starvation that MacArthur and the country, the U.S., staved off, in fact, would have occurred, or it would have even been worse?
Well, this gets into counterfactual history, which is, for years was treated as a pretty taboo subject for historians in America. You didn't talk counterfactual history. And one of the occasions for which, for the first time, the barriers on that were dropped on a widespread scale were with respect to the atomic bombs and the surrender of Japan. And the literature is just replete with counterfactual accounts of what would have happened without the bombs or various other permutations. And you're right, and I talk about this, and basically what you're looking at, the strategic bombing campaign was switching to firebombing about 30 more Japanese cities, but it was also aimed to destroy the rail system. And since we were already blockading Japan, so they weren't able to bring anything in, if we destroy the rail system, that means the rice surplus areas in Japan can't send rice to the deficit areas. And the implications of that are extremely dire with respect to the Japan in 1945. So yeah, I think with respect to that whole thing, we've had a lot of counterfactual writing about, if this had changed or that had changed, we would have gotten a result without the atomic bombs or this, that, or the other. And to my way of thinking, from having studied this for a long time, I think that's entirely the wrong way to look at it. What we should understand is that this was a very near-run thing, that things came out the way they did. If you start talking about changing things with the implicit assumption that only a better result could result, I think you've gone down the wrong path. I think ultimately I would describe it almost as a miraculous deliverance. And if you read contemporary accounts by both Americans and some Japanese, all of them were just startled that the war ended so suddenly, and basically before it went on to this agonizing culmination of the blockade, the bombardment, Russian invasion, whatever here. There's so many negative things that could have happened that didn't happen, and so few things with respect to these counterfactuals that we can say with any confidence would have happened without the way events played out. So that's my view.
We're going to have time for about 2, maybe 3 more questions. Rich, we're going to go to your right side here.
You pointed out how many Japanese lives were potentially saved because we fed them, they were starving. To what extent did we help the Chinese or the other East Asian people that were also starving at that time?
Well, we didn't, basically, is this answer to that. Everyone else was, I should emphasize, this was a worldwide phenomenon in 1945-46. This is not just in the Far East. One of the things I've been fascinated with is why this story about the big shipments of U.S. food to Japan had not been picked up in the historiography in any major degree or whatever here until I was looking at this. So I've gone back to the go-to source to find out what people were thinking in that period, which is you read the New York Times day by day, And reading that, you see immense amount of coverage of food shortages, potential starvation, real starvation, India, Germany, Europe. There's plenty of stories about that. Between July and September 1945, when I looked at the New York Times, I thought that's the period when there should be some coverage of this. And finally, you have to get to September before you finally see a mention of massive amounts of U.S. food, although it's just phrased, well, we shipped 680,000 tons of food to Japan to help the Japanese. But there is the coverage, even in the New York Times, does not give you a sense that saved, X number of lives at all. It's just, we shipped all this food to Japan. Oh, by the way, we shipped this food to Japan. It just doesn't come through whatsoever. So I'm still baffled. I'm still working on this whole question: is why wasn't this a better known story a lot sooner? Did it take Mrs. Frank's little boy to find some of this stuff or whatever? It's just, but it's one of the things that as a historian, you live for, to find something new and different. Our good buddy Barrett Tillman has a wonderful phrase: "What I found when I was looking for something else," and that some of the greatest things you ever do as a historian. That's exactly how you get there. You cast a wide net, and sure enough, something turns up you didn't expect whatsoever.
Rich, we're going to go all the way in the back with the gentleman standing by Connie.
You said something that struck me when you said that the American command was intentionally trying to take it easy on the Japanese. And I just found that interesting and wondered if that was a part of American legacy or what was the formation of that. I know that George Washington wanted to take it easy on the British after the Revolutionary War, and in the context of Pearl Harbor and Bataan Death March and the POW camps, it's very interesting.
Yeah. The planning for the occupation of Japan started it got really serious in 1944 into 45. And this very comprehensive plan, this blueprint of how the occupation of Japan was essentially handed to Douglas MacArthur. Now, when you hand a plan to Douglas MacArthur, it's like you gave him a menu to pick from. And the timing and the sequence of these things he chose very well, I would say, or whatever here. But there have been very comprehensive planning, and there was a deliberate decision that, okay, we were going to target the people we thought were truly responsible for Japan's rampage, the leadership. But we made it very clear right from the start that we weren't going to hold ordinary Japanese responsible for that and treat them. And it's, when you go through this in this literature on the occupation, one of the side issues in that, which is covered very extensively, is this elaborate planning as to how the occupation of Japan was going to be conducted. They also looked at, in that I should add, they looked at the whole issue of unconditional surrender, and the State Department lawyers made it very clear that basically if we'd not had unconditional surrender, we would have been under the military law of military occupation, which was in effect at that time, which effectively precluded us to do internal reforms of Japan. So the idea that unconditional surrender was not connected to important policy outcomes and the results of the occupation, that's a mistaken belief, and people haven't read the contemporary documents to figure out that they'd looked at that and figured out that it was extremely important that we had unconditional surrender.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Frank.
Thank you very much.
Well, Rich, what a great start to an amazing symposium ahead. Thank you, Rich. Thanks to the audience. Great questions. Keep those coming tomorrow during question and answer periods, but also during breaks, book signings, before we end tonight. And, of course, let everybody get copies of Rich's book, unless you have them already. Have a few points. While you're here this weekend, be sure to check in with our information desk. Get info about many upcoming opportunities we know you'll be interested in. First, our international conference, November 20th to 22nd of this year. Many of you know it well, but for those that don't, mark your calendars the 20th to the 22nd. We have a wide array of overseas educational tours and travel, many of which feature the distinguished historians, symposium speakers, and some of our own Institute historians. Also, maybe you're first to hear about it, but our team has been working closely with the History Channel and with Tom Hanks' team at Playtone for the upcoming History Channel 20-part series, World War II with Tom Hanks. This will be a major event in the World War II history community. We're honored and delighted to play a key role behind the scenes. A little bit of some of our folks on camera. But it'll be coming out next year, and you'll certainly hear more about it and the release dates, but we're excited and we're proud to be a part of that effort. Now for tonight, Rich will be signing books over on to my left. We can start our open house, which will run till 9 p.m., 2100 for those military time folks, right? You can see the galleries after hours. We have U.S. Freedom Pavilion here, Fighting for the Right to Fight, the special exhibit. Liberation Pavilion, which includes the viewing of our award-winning Freedom Theater on the third floor. Same award that Beyond All Boundaries won. Freedom Theater won that this past year. So hopefully you'll get a chance to see that if you haven't already. We'll also have a special presentation of our Illuminate the Night program with the Victory Bells performing in Stage Door Canteen at 8 p.m., followed at 8:30 by the Sound and Light Show, Expressions of America, just outside on the Barksdale Parade Ground. So 8 o'clock, Victory Bells, 8:30, Expressions of America. And of course, for those, since Rich has been talking about famine, the American Sector Restaurant is open late. It'll be open till 9 p.m. Cafe Normandy at the hotel is also open till 9. So, don't leave out. Tomorrow we'll be in the Arcadia Ballroom at the Higgins on the second floor. You've scoped that out. There's breakfast available there from 7 to 9 on the Arcadia Terrace. The program will start at 9 a.m. We'll open the doors for seating as soon as the room is set for the day, so don't break in before that. Once it's set, we'll be good. I would tell you, though, C-SPAN will be broadcasting live tomorrow. And so have great questions, but just so everybody knows, there's a disclaimer. Tomorrow morning, we'll have breakfast for you. Be ready. We've got a great day ahead. Thanks for staying with me with the announcements. More importantly, thanks for being here, and thanks for all your support. One last round of applause for Rich this evening. Hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you this evening, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.